Good morning, everybody. We're back to ABF, and we're trying to figure out how the story ends. And we've come to chapter 21 of Revelation, where John, in the new heavens and the new earth, sees something remarkable. He sees a holy city descending out of heaven from God to earth. And this city he calls the New Jerusalem. And he says it's adorned and prepared like a bride who is adorned for her husband. There's a sense of anticipation and excitement about what is going to come once this city arrives on earth. And we'll talk all about what happens once it comes in a minute, but we've been looking at the backstory on this New Jerusalem, because basically what you have is you have a Jerusalem 2.0 that goes along with an earth 2.0. In the original world, we had a Jerusalem. We're going to talk about that today. Earth 1.0 had a Jerusalem where certain things happen, and now in the new world, the major difference between the old world, Earth 1.0, and Earth 2.0 is that instead of Jerusalem 1.0, we have a brand new Jerusalem, and it's a different kind of Jerusalem from the Jerusalem that we had under Earth 1.0, and so we're trying to figure out what is that. And in order to understand the differences between the two, we're going back in the story and taking a look at how this idea of cities has developed over time throughout the story of the Bible. And initially what we found is that in the book of Genesis, the concept of cities is an incredibly negative thing. You have Cain, who was told by God, I want you to wander, I want you to travel around the world, I want you to trust me daily for your provision and for protection. Don't settle down, don't do that. He decides instead to surround himself with a bunch of other people who want to settle down. They build a city where they don't have to depend on God. They can be independent of God, and they can provide for themselves, and they can protect themselves. And then they build this civilization that becomes so wicked and so evil, yes, technologically advanced and very impressive on that level, but so evil and so wicked, God has to wipe them out and start all over again. And then you come post-flood, and humanity is supposed to, again, spread out through the entire earth, settle the entire earth, fill the earth. And instead, they huddle together on the plain of Shinar. They build a new city, and this new city is designed to showcase their incredible genius and to make a name for themselves so that they don't have to obey God. They don't have to spread out and go off into the earth and do what God called them to do. They want to call the shots. They want to make a name for themselves. They want to be the masters of their own fate. And so they set themselves up as the antithesis to what God wants. And so God goes and he spreads them out. He just confuses their languages so that they have to spread out. And he's sort of, you can see God is doing this to slow down the spread and the corruption of sin. Because when fallen humans get together in large quantities in small spaces, we, yes, are able to work together to accomplish great technological things, but we also work together to build rebellion and evil against God, and we end up creating a world filled with oppression. So that we go back and look in chapter 10, and we have the first empire post-flood of these people scattered out throughout the earth. The first empire builder's name is Nimrod, and he builds a series of cities that become oppressive cities to God's people. Cities like Nineveh, cities like places like Assyria and Babylon, and even Egypt is part of that whole thing. So all of these government structures that mankind building a name for themselves, saying, I'm in charge, I'm the master of my own fate, and these cities are my proof that I'm something special. God sees those, and the writer of Genesis sees those cities as largely being a negative thing. And so when God sets his people free from Egypt, one of these oppressive city kingdoms that have oppressed God's people and opposed God's work in the world, and he sets them free, and then he gives them their own nation in Israel, he decides to do it differently. And this time, there's going to be no central government, there's no capital city, there's no thing. The closest thing we have to a capital city is the tabernacle. And the tabernacle, of course, right, is that tent where God meets with the priests to forgive his people for their sins and also to provide guidance and direction for them. And the tabernacle itself, which is God's capital, is a mobile home. It travels around from place to place. It doesn't stay in one place. God is trying desperately to create a different structure for his people so they won't have the same attitude that city builders have had from the dawn of time. And that's that idea of making a name for themselves and being the master of their own fate and not needing God and building my own world. And who cares what God thinks? I'm going to write my own rules. So we come to the end of that phase with a remarkable thing. The people come to Samuel, who is the judge, sort of leading the nation at that time, and they say, we want a king just like all the other nations. We don't want to depend on God. We don't want to call God. We don't want to put God in our 911 and have God be the person we call when we're in trouble, because we don't know if we can control him. But if we got a guy who has an army, we know we can control him. And so we want a king just like all the other nations to fight our battles for us. And Samuel goes, you have rejected God as your king by doing this. You realize this, right? And they're like, we want a king. And so Samuel goes to God, and God is hurt, and Samuel is hurt. And God's like, look, Samuel, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. But then God says an amazing thing. He says, give him a king. Fine. Let him have a king. But warn them what's going to happen. Warn them what happens when humanity centralizes power into a government structure and gives all of that power to a king. He's going to start taking your children away to serve him. He's going to start taking taxes from you to pay for his stuff. It's not going to be the easy, happy, fun thing you think it's going to be. And they're like, oh, okay, great. And so they choose Saul. Now, Saul, it's hard to say whether or not Saul is the beginning of a new era or the ending of an old era, because Saul acts a lot like a judge in his early days of his kingship. For one thing, he never establishes a capital city either. You see him all the time in different places. He's here with the army, and then he's there with the army. He's here and there. He's all over the place. And yet he has a city that's his home city, but you see him hanging out in other places doing things. He sort of travels around a little bit too. He's also a little bit mobile. So he doesn't truly do the king thing the way the nations around them do. He's sort of a holdover from an ancient time. But Saul's not really the one God wanted anyway. God wanted David. And so David becomes king, and for a long time he's being hunted and harassed and chased. He's a wanderer throughout the earth, trying to escape Saul, who's trying to kill him. And David develops this dependent relationship upon God. And he cries out to God. In fact, some of the most beautiful psalms are psalms where David's like, someone's trying to kill me, God. And we all know in the background it's Saul. Saul's trying to kill him. God, I need you to provide for me. I need you to protect me. Like David had to live in the wilderness among rocks and holes in the ground. How in the world is he going to survive long enough to become the king that God chose for his people? Well, it's not going to happen unless God, who's the real king, doesn't provide for you and protect you. And so David experiences all that. God makes him the king after Saul dies. And then David begins to act a little bit like one of these pagan kings. He decides, you know what? This mobile thing that we're doing, I really don't want to do that. I want to establish a capital, a central location that has strategic importance to a region, both politically and militarily, and then later we'll see spiritually. And I want that to be the hub of my kingdom, because David is the first conquering king that Israel has. In other words, David expands the borders of the kingdom. Saul was sort of just hanging out with what he already had, trying to protect it from people that are attacking it. David's the first king to say, let's expand this. Let's spread this out further. Let's have our influence go beyond the four corners of what we used to have, and let's see what we can get here. So David's ambitious. Now, let's talk about the third. I think it's like a little star that you have there on your notes. This is the first major city seen in a positive light in the Bible is the city, here's the blank, of Jerusalem. So up until Jerusalem comes along, everything is sort of seen. Cities are kind of negative. It's sort of not the way God wants to do business. It's sort of God knows how dangerous they are for fallen humanity because it encourages all of our worst impulses. But then you have God's chosen king, David, who decides, you know what, I want to do something kind of like what the kings around me do. I want my own capital. And so he picks the city of Jebus, which has been around forever, which is located up in the mountains in the southern part of Israel, that sort of controls a very important stretch of real estate. And he says, I'm going to conquer that city, and I'm going to make that my city. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is where it happens. 2 Samuel chapter 5. This is after David has finally consolidated his power. He's finally been anointed king of Israel. He's fighting against God's enemies. And then we come here. Actually, go ahead and starting in verse 4. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah for 33 years. Now look at verse 6. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites. Now they're the original owners of this piece of real estate called Jerusalem, up in the mountains and the hills around this very important valley that controls a highway that goes from Egypt all the way to Assyria, okay? Very important piece of real estate to control if you want to have control over that whole area. He goes to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here, but the blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David cannot come in here. They thought they were so secure in their place up in kind of in this mountain fortress. There's no way David can get in here to us. Sure, down on the plains, David can fight hand to hand, and he can be. But when we're like up here with the high ground, and like we have our fortifications, no way can David get in here. Nevertheless, verse 7, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is, the city of David. Catch that? So David decides, and go ahead down to verse 9. And David lived in the stronghold and called it the city of David. And David built the city all around from the Millo inward. Verse 10, and David became greater and greater, for the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. He decided, you know what, I want that piece of real estate. Why? Because it's strategic both politically and militarily. And that's what goes in the two blanks there under the first arrow. David makes Jerusalem a strategic political and military center early in his reign. He's like, you know what? I've just been announced king over all of Israel. I know what I need. I need a capital city. I need like a fortress that everybody knows. This is the city of David. This is where David's going to be. If you need help, you go to Jerusalem because that's where David's going to be, and he'll come and help you. If you have taxes, they all need to be delivered to Jerusalem because that's where David is. He wanted to have a central hub, a capital city. And that's, again, a departure from the way Saul did things and certainly by the way the judges did things, the way God did things during the time of Joshua and the judges and Samuel and Saul. So this is different. And so far we're kind of like, if you've been paying attention all along, you're kind of nervous about this. You're like, okay, David, I kind of see what you're, from a political perspective, I get it. Centralizing power makes sense. Everybody knowing who's in charge makes sense. Having one person giving orders versus 20 makes a certain amount of sense if you want to get things done. And then militarily, totally makes sense because you've got to be able to send out your army to control this pathway here. If you get an army coming up from Egypt, you need to be able to intercept them. If there's an army coming south from Assyria and Babylon, you need to be able to intercept them and stop them. Possessing this piece of land makes perfect military sense. If you control this rock, you control everything else. So from a political and military sense, it makes perfect sense. But again, if you've been reading the story so far and sort of the mixed, not even mixed feelings, the negative feelings God has towards cities and the capacity of cities and fallen humans coming together for bad purposes as well as for good ones, you're at least a little bit nervous for David. And I think the history of Israel plays this out in real time. So even though God is going to now make Jerusalem sort of like the capital city of Israel, it's not without its dangers. In fact, we're going to get to that. The same thing happens to David's descendants, these kings that take over for him in the years to come. The same thing happens to them that happened to Nebuchadnezzar, that happened to the pharaohs, that happened to Nimrod. They start to build this empire, and their pride and their hubris, all the problems that happen in the cities out there happen in this particular city as well. But David is determined, we're going to do it this way. And then I want you to notice this. Not only does he make it the political and the military center, but he very quickly moves to make Jerusalem here's the blank here. David moves quickly to establish Jerusalem as a spiritual center for his kingdom by moving the tabernacle to Jerusalem. Look at verse 1 of chapter 6. So chapter 5 just happened. He just established his kingdom in Jerusalem. And now chapter 6, the very next chapter, David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. So David has designs to bring the tabernacle, to bring the ark of God, and really the tabernacle, right? It's just the house for the ark. The ark of God is where God's presence resides. That's where his presence comes down to forgive and to provide guidance and direction for his people. It's right there in the ark of the covenant. That's the central thing. And then the tabernacle is just like a tent. It's like a home for that to protect it from being polluted. So David brings the ark and with it the tabernacle from its mobile residence and other places. And it says, you know what? We're going to set you up here in Jerusalem. Verse 12. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Now, everybody's excited. Everybody's excited because now God's home is going to live with their king in this city called Jerusalem. So the center of power, not just political and military power, but now religious, spiritual power is all going to become focused on this city named Jerusalem. Okay? And then eventually we know what happens in the very next chapter. You look at chapter 7. So 2 Samuel 7. Now when the king lived in his house, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, see, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. David starts to go, maybe I don't want God's ark to be here just temporarily, and then maybe we'll send the ark out whenever God wants to move it somewhere else. What if, I live in a permanent house. Why would I think God wouldn't want to live in a permanent house as well? And so anyway, he decides he wants to build God a house, right? A permanent home, a temple for the ark to dwell in forever in Jerusalem. And at first, God kind of hems and haws about it and says, no, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. But God uses it as an opportunity to build that covenant with David and establish his connection with David, because God knows it comes out of a good place. Like David's like, why should I enjoy a luxury that God doesn't get to enjoy? So let me build something for God that's as good or better than what I built for myself. And God kind of is like, look, that's not how I set it up. That's not what I wanted, but it's good. It's a good thing that you had it in your heart. And then God makes a decision. God decides to go with David's plan. And God decides to allow David to instruct his son Solomon on how to build a kingdom, a temple for him. So here we go. Let me give you the statement here under the third arrow. Eventually, David directs his son Solomon to build God a temple to take the place of the tabernacle, thereby establishing Jerusalem as God's permanent home, his permanent home. Take a look at how that played out in 1 Kings chapter 8. Hit pause, find it, and then hit unpause again. 1 Kings 8 verse 12 says this, then Solomon said, the Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. In other words, God doesn't need a home. He doesn't need a house. He doesn't need a place. He's not a person like you and me that needs to get in out of the elements. God is perfectly fine living in endless space because he's so big he can't be contained, right? Verse 13, I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. Then the king turned around and blessed all the assembly of Israel while all the assembly of Israel stood. And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, who with his hand has fulfilled what he promised with his mouth to David my father, saying, since the day that I brought my people Israel out of Egypt, I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house. Did you catch that? Solomon acknowledges that up until this point, God had not chosen one place to dwell. He had not chosen one place that he was going to christen as his own, his place, his city. That wasn't the way he did things. And God seems to be perfectly content with that. But there's a change now. I chose no city out of all the tribes of Israel in which to build a house that my name might be there. But, he says, I chose David to be over my people Israel. Now, it was in the heart of David my father to build a house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. But the Lord said to David my father, whereas it was in your heart to build a house for my name, you did well that it was in your heart. Now, it was a good idea. Nevertheless, you shall not build the house, but your son who shall be born to you shall build the house for my name. Now the Lord has fulfilled his promise that he made, for I have risen in the place of David my father. I sit on the throne of Israel, as the Lord promised, and I have built the house for the name of the Lord, the God of Israel. And there I have provided a place for the ark, in which is the covenant of the Lord that he made with our fathers when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. So now Jerusalem is going to be God's permanent home. It's the place where God dwells. It's the place where God resides, where God has made his name to be. God has marked the city of Jerusalem as his, and he belongs there. Because remember, in the ancient world, you don't just have a military and political capital, you have a religious capital as well, because your God is the one who gave you your kingdom. The same thing is the case here. Solomon is saying, look, God gave me this kingdom. He rose me up to be David's descendant and David's son on the throne of Israel. I want God with me here, because it's only by leaning on God for support and strength that I'm going to be able to do a good job of this. And then what we find out is that God takes up residence in the temple, right? Because Solomon can build it all day if he wants to. David could try to build God a temple. If God never actually moves in, then it's really not God's house. It's sort of a nice thing you did for him. But God decides in chapter 9, very next chapter, he interacts with Solomon, and this is what he says in verse 1. As soon as Solomon had finished building the house of the Lord and the king's house and all that Solomon desired to build, the Lord appeared to Solomon a second time, as he had appeared to him in Gibeon. Verse 3. Listen, this is stunning. This is such a change from how God has done things up until this point. It's a marked change. Verse 3. And the Lord said to him, I have heard your prayer and your plea, which you have made before me. I have consecrated this house. What does that mean? God has set this apart. He's made it holy. He's injected it with something special. He's put his touch on it, right? Like, have you noticed the difference between when a contractor finishes building a house and then a family, specifically probably more the mom, but it can be both husband and mom and kids. But then you notice how when they settle into the house, they consecrate it. They make it theirs. They make it their own. They paint colors. They hang paintings. They arrange furniture. They do certain things. They tweak the original design to kind of make it feel lived in. What God says is, hey, you built me a house, and good job. It's a nice house. But now God's saying, I've consecrated it. I'm moving in. I'm going to put my own mark on this place. This place is going to be set aside holy for me forever. Look what it says. I have consecrated this house that you have built. Look at this. Putting my name there forever. God's name is now forever attached to Jerusalem. And at this point, it's Jerusalem 1.0. God says, look, this is going to be my home from now on. This is my name. This is the place I claim as my own, is Jerusalem. And then he says this, my eyes and my heart will be there for all time. God is saying, I'm not going to move around anymore. I'm going to stay fixed right here. Now, obviously, God can still manage the affairs of the rest of Israel and the rest of the world. Oh, and by the way, the rest of the cosmos for that matter, right? God is not restricted. But what God is saying is, I'm going to be in Jerusalem in a way that I'm nowhere else, a specific way. And Jerusalem is going to be marked by name. My name is going to be on this temple. And because it's connected to the city, it's going to be connected to this city forever. And then 2 Chronicles tells us the story about this exact same event. And in 2 Chronicles chapter 7, what we find out is that after Solomon has dedicated the temple, something specific happens. So push pause, find 2 Corinthians 7, and then come back, push unpause, and I'm going to start reading in chapter 7, verse 1. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And listen to this, the glory of the Lord filled the temple. What does that mean? That means God took up residence in that house. God moved in. His glory filled the temple. God is saying with his presence, hey, I'm here. This is mine. This is my city. This is my home. This is where I'm going to be. I am taking up residence. I am living and dwelling among my people right here in Jerusalem in this temple. Verse 2, and the priests could not enter the house of the Lord because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. When all the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement, and they worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. This is Mount Sinai all over again. The people at the bottom of the mountain looking up at this mountain, seeing the glory of God on the top of the mountain, bowing down with their faces to the ground. Here they're like, wow, God's not up on the mountain anymore. God is living on this mountain with us in our midst. Like, this is our city, and he lives with us here. And they worship God. God lives with us. And he's good. And his steadfast love endures forever. And ever since then, Jerusalem has been a city like no other. Now, before I do that, let me get to these blanks, because I know I skipped them by accident. The fourth arrow. God takes up residence in the temple in Jerusalem, right? That's what happened here, what we just saw. Forever linking the Davidic line, right? David and his descendants. Davidic is the word there. And his presence, his glory, you can put either one, glory or presence, to the city of Jerusalem. So now what we have in Jerusalem 1.0, this city is different. This city is different from every other city that's ever been, because in this city, what you have is you have God living there. That's significant. That's huge. But not only that, you have God, and then you have David. Or, in this case, David's descendants, his line, Solomon, and then Rehoboam and all the other guys that came after him. But it's not just God connected to David, it's God and David all connected also to a physical spot in the universe called Jerusalem. So God, David, and Jerusalem now are tied together. In fact, in times to come in the future, there are times when God wants to destroy the people that are running Jerusalem at the time and running his temple. He wants to punish them, and he says this, for the sake of my servant David, I will not do that right now. I will delay. I'll put it off. I'll postpone. For the sake of my servant David. Why? Because God's promise to become a resident of Jerusalem and the temple there is also connected to his promises to David to honor David and give David the right to rule his people. So it's all intermingled. It's all intertwined. And going forward now, if you look at the rest of the Old Testament, and the New Testament for that matter, the rest of the Old Testament, the people of Israel revere the city of Jerusalem like no other city. There's no other city that compares to Jerusalem. In fact, when they're in exile in Babylon, they turn towards the city Jerusalem and they pray towards the city. I'm pretty sure, I'm going to look this up really quick. This was not in the notes. But when Daniel gets thrown in jail, right? Thrown in the lion's den for praying to God, I think it's because he was praying. Hold on a second here. Oh my word, where is it? Okay, yeah. Verse 10 of Daniel 6 says, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. So he's in exile. He doesn't even live in Israel anymore. He doesn't live in God's place. He lives way far away from God. But he even opens up his windows and prays towards Jerusalem. Why? Because Jerusalem is where God was. And it's where the king was. And the nation is all connected to this one city called Jerusalem. And it's a city that's like no other. Let me just give you a sampling of how the people of Israel talked about and thought about Jerusalem. And I'm not going to look up all these references. I put them all there, though, so if you want to do a little Bible study, you can look at them all and see them all stacked on top of each other. But for one thing, this first subpoint under that arrow is this. It is the city where Yahweh has chosen to put his name. And God's name, remember, the thing about God's name that's such a big deal. Like when you hear the word Toby, you don't necessarily know anything about what I'm like, because Toby is just a name. It's been given to a million other people. And you know, if you like Tobey Maguire, the Spider-Man, and you like him, then maybe you like me. If you hate country music and you think of Toby Keith whenever you hear the word Toby, you may not like me. Because the name Toby itself doesn't mean anything significant. It's just a name we attach to various people. But God's name is different. See, God's name, Yahweh, God's name is a reflection of his character. It's who he is, right? He is the I am. He is the self-existent one. He is the God who is, who exists, the self-existent God who depends upon no one else. When you say the name Yahweh, you're telling me something about your God. You're saying he is the foundation of all existence. He is the self-existent one. He has existed before everything. Everything that exists because of him. He is what holds the universe together. He is the very air we breathe. He is Yahweh. And God said, this Jerusalem, city of Jerusalem, I'm putting my name there. So that when you walk by and you see this city marked by my name, you see me in a way you never saw it before. And several times, Daniel does it in Daniel chapter 9. He calls it the city called by your name. This is God's city. And then the second thing, many times in Nehemiah 11, Isaiah 48, 52, even Matthew 4 or 5, Jesus, or Matthew when he's writing about it, he calls Jerusalem the holy city. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean that everybody in it was holy and nothing bad ever happened there? No. It means that of all the cities in the world, this one city was set apart. That's what the next two blanks are there. Set apart to the Lord. This is God's unique city. This is where God lives. This is where God's name is. And this city belongs to God in a way that no other city belongs to God. This city has been set aside for God's purposes in a way that no other city has been set aside for God's purposes, okay? So you go to a Major League Baseball game, and you go down into the dugout, and they have these cute little cubbies on the wall, right? It's just like we're back in kindergarten again. In this cubby, they have room for a bat, and sometimes, I don't know if they put their helmets in there and their gloves, but it's a spot for them, and it's marked for them, and that's their bat, their helmet, their gloves. Nobody else touches those, right? If I'm going up to bat, I don't just go and grab from anybody's cubby whatever bat I want and just run out there. I don't have a generic bat that's for the whole team and we all share the bat. No, there's a bat for each individual player. They have it the way they like it. It's the right weight, it's the right length, it's the right size. They feels good, the good grip in their hands, and they use that. That is theirs. It is holy. It is set apart for their purposes. And if you go and grab that, suppose you're a ball boy or a bat boy, and you just grab a bat and it's like run out home with somebody else's bat, you're going to be held accountable for that because it's not to be used by anybody for any reason. It's only to be used for specific purposes. That's what it means for a city to be holy. Yes, sometimes it means set apart from sin, but most of the time it means set apart for a specific purpose. And this specific purpose is for God to live with his people and to rule over his people through the descendant of David, who's the king. It's there. So it's a holy city. It's set apart to the Lord. And then the third thing, many times it's just called, and you look all throughout the Psalms, right? Matthew 46, 48, also Matthew 5, Psalm 101.101.8, even Isaiah 60. And then Isaiah 45, God himself calls it my city. It's my city. It's God's city. That's the way the people thought about it and talked about it. That's why Daniel, when he's praying, opens up his windows to face Jerusalem, because this is the piece of real estate. This is the land that God has chosen to dwell, where God lives with the Davidic king in the city of Jerusalem, and all the fates of all these things are tied all together. It's the central focus of Judaism, and it's the central focus of the worship of the Old Testament. And that's the way God designed it to set up. It seems like initially he had a different way of doing things, and whether David just really wanted to do it that way and God said okay, or whether God had planned for David to bring about the change, there's been a change, And now God has focused his presence and his power and his reign on one city, and from there, he's going to rule the rest of the nation. Now, here's the sad part of the story. You ready for this? Tragically, this city of Jerusalem, which was meant to be set apart for God and his purposes, the place where God dwells, where God's name is, over time, this city falls prey to the same problems that have afflicted cities from Cain's time through the Tower of Babel, through Nimrod's kingdom, through Babylon's kingdom, Assyria's kingdom, Egypt's kingdom, kingdoms all over the world. The same problems that afflicted those cities eventually come home to roost in this city as well. Some kings do a phenomenal job of leading the people to know God. David is one. Hezekiah is another. Asa is another one. Josiah, my favorite, probably does the most amazing job of them all in some ways. I'll tell you about that some other time. But some of the kings do it right. But you know what? Some of the kings do it horribly, horribly wrong. Not only do they not devote themselves to the worship and the obedience of God, their king, but they decide they're going to be in charge. They're going to make a name for themselves. They're going to run things the way they want. They're going to be independent of God. They're going to, in fact, form alliances with other nations because they don't want to have to depend upon God for help in times of military problems. And then they start worshiping other people's gods. And at first they start off hiding into the corners of the country and worshiping these gods kind of on the down low where God, they think, can't see. And then eventually they become more brazen and more bold and more arrogant and more proud and more full of hubris. And eventually they start worshiping false gods in God's home, in God's house. That's why God doesn't like cities as a general rule. Because cities tend towards the accumulation of power, and with the accumulation of power comes corruption and sin. And unless that power is checked by a devotion to God who has power over the king will grab the power, ignore God, and do an incredible disservice to Jerusalem and to the people who live there. So tragically, here's the next arrow. Tragically, Jerusalem becomes, here's the blank, corrupted by the evil and idolatrous actions of many of David's descendants. Now, God even warned that this could happen all the way back when he first moved in, back in 1 Kings chapter 9. Would you pause and go to 1 Kings 9 and then come back and unpause, would you? 1 Kings chapter 9, I want to show you the warning that God gave to Solomon, because it's almost like God says to Solomon, okay, we'll do it this way. We'll do it this way, and there will be a lot of good that comes from this. There will be a lot of advantages to having a central location and having me in one place, and there will be some good things, but there's also some potential for danger. And so God warns Solomon, he's like, look, it's all on how you respond to having me here with you in Jerusalem. It's all on how you respond to me and how you're responsive to my authority, so whether or not this is going to go well or this is going to go poorly. So verse 6, it says, but if you turn aside, God says to Solomon, from following me, you or your children, and do not keep my commandments and my statutes that I have set before you, but go and serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land that I have given them and the house that I have consecrated for my name. I will cast out of my sight. So even the house, God's like, look, just because I've moved into this house doesn't mean that I have to stay here no matter what you do. You don't have any control over me simply because I've decided to make this my permanent mailing address. If you disobey me and you turn away from me and you serve other gods, you become loyal to them instead of to me, then I'm just going to abandon this house. I'm going to cast it out of my sight, and Israel will become a proverb and a byword among all peoples, and this house will become a heap of ruins. There's nothing about the bricks and mortar of this building that's going to make me stay if you treat me with disrespect. If you dishonor me by abandoning me and worshiping other gods, I'm not going to stay just because I went through the trouble of putting my name in this house. No, I'm going to destroy it, and I'm going to destroy you. And they will say, why has the Lord done this to this land and to this house? Verse 9. Then they will say, because they abandoned the Lord their God who brought their fathers out of the land of Egypt and laid hold on other gods and worshiped them and served them. Therefore, the Lord has brought all this disaster on them. And you know what's really, really sad? Solomon doesn't even make it through his entire lifetime before he himself does this. Solomon abandons God. He builds temples for his wives' gods. They pull his heart astray, as God warned that they would. And Solomon ends his days splitting his time between God and worshiping false deities. His sons follow in his footsteps. Some regain the mentality of their father, their ancestor David, but most of them are following Solomon's ways. And some of them just abandon God completely and just decide, you know what, we're going to use the temple where God has put his name to be the place where we worship other gods. And God looks at that and he sees that as a form of adultery. He sees that as a form of adultery. Push pause as you turn to Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah, you can unpause it when you find this and come back to me. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 21 says this. How the faithful city has become a whore, she who was full of justice. Righteousness lodged in her, the city, but now murderers. Your silver has become dross, your best wine mixed with water. Your princes are rebels and companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe, runs after gifts. They do not bring justice to the fatherless, and the widow's cause does not come to them. The faithful city of David in the early days of Solomon has now become a whore, a prostitute, someone who is spiritually adulterous and unfaithful to God. And everything that God designed and desired for Jerusalem to be has now become corrupted and perverted. And this was the danger in doing a city in the first place, because this is what happens all over the world. You centralize power and fallenness gets together, and fallenness feeds on fallenness, and pretty soon oppression is happening everywhere. And Isaiah is saying it's even happened in God's faithful city. So because of that, here's the second blank under that arrow. The kings of Judah, and they must be destroyed by God. God has to do what he promised to do in 1 Kings chapter 9, which is if you abandon me, I'm going to destroy this house. I'm going to leave it, I'm going to abandon it, and I'm going to destroy it. And then the nations are going to look at your destruction and say, why did that happen? And the answer is going to be because they abandoned the God who got them there. And so you come to 2 Kings, push pause and go to 2 Kings 23. 2 Kings 23. And I'm flipping around a lot because I want you to see this is a theme that runs through the entire Old Testament. So important. 2 Kings 23 verse 27 says this. Verse 26. Still the Lord did not turn from the burning of his great wrath by which his anger was kindled against Judah because of all the provocations with which Manasseh, who was one of the previous kings, had provoked him. And the Lord said, I will remove Judah also out of my sight, as I have removed Israel, and I will cast off this city that I have chosen, Jerusalem, and the house of which I have said, my name shall be there. So God is saying, you know what? Jerusalem 1.0 has some significant problems. Jerusalem 1.0 is not living up to the hype. It's not accomplishing what they originally intended for it to accomplish. So yeah, it was the city where God's name was. It was God's holy city. It was set apart for God's purposes. And when you had good kings, the good kings led the people to do incredibly wonderful things for God. But there are so many kings that corrupted their way and treated it like any pagan king would. And so God is like, okay, I'm not going to just stick around for this. I told you what would happen, and now it's going to happen. Now, part of that destruction, before the actual destruction comes, and by the way, who does the destroying? Nebuchadnezzar does. Nebuchadnezzar, God brings in a pagan nation even worse than Israel and says, you know what, you know how bad you are? I'm going to bring your worst neighbors over to destroy you because of how bad you are. Nebuchadnezzar comes and destroys the temple in 586 BC. 586 BC. So God brings in Nebuchadnezzar to fulfill this part of it. But here's the sad part. I want to show you the book of Ezekiel a little bit. This is something that I hadn't planned to do, but you know what? It's so interesting and it's so good. It's important. And I want you to get it. So we're going to talk a little bit about Ezekiel. Because before the actual destruction of the building, God's glory was removed, right? It's not like Nebuchadnezzar overcame God while God was still trying to hold on to the temple and make it a place where his name could be known among the nations. No, that's not the way it worked. God withdrew from the temple, withdrew his protection from the temple, and then the nations came and destroyed it. But let me show you this. Go to Ezekiel chapter 8. Ezekiel. I know we haven't spent a lot of time in Ezekiel since I've been here. Probably that needs to change at some point. And for now, I guess it is changing a little bit because we're going to talk about Ezekiel chapter 8. I'm going to do my best over the next 15 minutes or so to try to dive into these passages. And I really want you to see this because this is so significant. Remember. When God decided to move into Jerusalem, how did he make it clear that he had accepted the deal and that he was actually going to move in? He moved in, and when he moved in, the glory of God, right? The glory of God filled the temple. In fact, for some points, they filled the temple so much, to such an extreme degree, that even the priests couldn't do their normal work. Like, it's too bright, and we just can't take it. And God, can you put the dimmer switch on and kind of dim it a little bit so we can get our work done? And God's like, sure, fine. But God was excited. And God is like, look, my glory is going to be here because God's glory is also connected to God's presence. Wherever God is, his glory is. And you remember his glory, we talked about this at length before. His glory is the physical manifestation, the visible manifestation of God's character. God shows us who he is in visible form, and we're blown away by it. So God's glory and God's presence are here in Jerusalem 1.0, in Temple 1.0. And then Ezekiel now is going to tell us about the incredibly sad, tragic story about how Israel, and I'll just give you the blanks first, and then we'll look at the passages. The blank here under the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the seventh arrow says, Israel's idolatry, that's the first blank, in the temple itself drives God's glory from the temple and eventually from the entire city of Jerusalem. So God has to abandon the house and the city that he had set aside for his own particular purpose. He even put his name in. And the reason he has to abandon it is because of the idolatry in the temple itself. Now let's dive into the story starting in chapter 8 of Ezekiel, verse 1. Ezekiel 8:1 says this, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house with the elders of Judah sitting before me, the hand of the Lord fell upon me there. Okay, Ezekiel's like, I was hanging out with the elders, doing what I normally do, and all of a sudden God decided it's time to send a message. So he puts his hand on me. Verse 2, then I looked and behold a form that had the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness like gleaming metal. Okay, he's struggling, he doesn't know what to describe. It's like a super bright thing. Verse 3, he put out the form of a hand, and he took me by a lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God. And where does he bring him to? To Jerusalem. Now, we know from this, and what we're about to read, that God actually transports Ezekiel back to Jerusalem 1.0. Where's Ezekiel? Ezekiel's in Babylon. He's in exile too, like Daniel. He's there with God's people by the rivers of Babylon or whatever. And so he is far from home, and he's hanging out with the Jewish exiles there in Babylon, and all of a sudden God grabs him by the hair and says, I want to show you what's going on back in Jerusalem 1.0 right now. Because you need to understand this, because I have a message to give to the people that are in exile about what's happening back home. Then he says here, verse 3, he brought me out, he put out the form of a hand, took me by a lock of my head, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north. Now, inner court, what, of the king's palace? No. The inner court of the temple. That's all that matters here. Because the temple's where God lives. Where the king lives is secondary. Where God lives in the temple, that's the heart, that's the beating heart of Jerusalem 1.0, is the temple. Because that's where God lives. He says this. To the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. You know what that means? that in the inner court on the north side, there had set up an image, an idol to another god. And every time that God was present in his own home, he saw an image to another god. And it provoked him to jealousy. Every time he's reminded when he comes into his home that there is part of his people that have given their hearts away to other gods. It would be like if you were married and your spouse kept a picture of their mistress or of their lover on the mantle. Like, that's not who they're supposed to be with. That's a betrayal of everything. And to come marching by it every time I walk into my home, I see this giant picture, a poster on the wall of this person that my spouse is now having an affair with. Like right there in front of my eyes, this is going to provoke me to jealousy, and certainly it provokes God to jealousy in his own house. And look at verse 4. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision I saw in the valley. God's glory is present with that idol, and it's like disgusted by it. Look at verse 5. Then he said to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes now toward the north. So I lifted up my eyes toward the north, and behold, north of the altar gate in the entrance was this image of jealousy. All of a sudden, Ezekiel sees it too. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? The great abominations that the house of Israel are committing here to drive me far from my sanctuary. Did you catch that? God's not saying, I'm going to take my ball and go home. He's saying, no, they're kicking me out of my own house. They're sending me away. God doesn't want to go. God doesn't want to leave. God's not punishing them. God doesn't hate them. God wants to stay. But these people's idolatry, the fact that they've given their hearts over to other gods, God's jealous, and God's like, I can't stay here. You're pushing me away by your idolatry and by your lack of faithfulness. And then he says this, you will see greater abominations. Verse 7, and he brought me to the entrance of the court. Am I going probably too far? Anyway, okay. Sometime read the rest of chapter 8 and the rest of chapter 9. Because God goes and he shows Ezekiel place after place after place within the temple itself where people are devoting themselves and worshiping other gods. It would be the same thing as if a spouse came home from work and had security camera footage of their spouse being unfaithful to them in various rooms of that house as he comes home and looks at it. And there they are. All the adultery that's happening in this room and in that room and in this room and in that room. And Israel is just flaunting her brazenness, flaunting her unwillingness to submit herself to God. I mean, this is intense. This is crazy. And then we come to chapter 9, verse 9. Then he said to me, the guilt of the house of Israel and Judah is exceedingly great. The land is full of blood, and the city is full of injustice. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see. As for me, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. I will bring their deeds upon their heads, right? The punishment that we talked about, the destruction. But then, jump ahead with me to chapter 10, verse 3. Ezekiel looks past that and he sees the cherubim. These are these angelic beings that are a lot like the four living creatures we talked about in Revelation chapter 4 and 5. In fact, a lot of people think they're the same thing. They really are talking about the same thing. And here we have in verse 3, it says, now the cherubim were standing on the south side of the house when the man went in, and a cloud filled the inner court. Well, the cloud represents the glory of God. Verse 4, and the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the house, and the house was filled with the cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord. And the sound of the wings of the cherubim was heard as far as the outer court, like the voice of God Almighty when he speaks. So step one, God is there on the Ark of the Covenant by the cherub, and that's where he always is. That's where he resides. That's where he dwells. But he can't stay there, not with the abominations that have taken place. And so what does God do? God retreats. But he doesn't leave right away. He goes to the outer threshold of the room, and he looks down on that spot. And it's like he lingers. It's like he's telling his people, don't make me go away. Don't kick me out. Don't continue to be unfaithful to me. I don't want to go. I don't want to leave. And yet that's exactly what he does. Let's keep going. Jump down to verse 18 of the same chapter. Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim. And the cherubim lifted up their wings and mounted up from the earth before my eyes as they went out, with the wheels beside them. And they stood at the entrance of the east gate of the house of the Lord, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. So God leaves the middle section of the temple, and now he goes to the outside of the outer court, and he's looking in. And it's almost like he pauses again. People, don't leave me. Don't make me go. Don't force me out by your sin, by your idolatry. Please be faithful to me. Love me. Worship me. I want to stay. And yet God can't stay because they persist in their sin. So what happens next? Jump down to chapter 11, verse 22. Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain that is on the east side of the city. And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in the vision by the Spirit of God into Chaldea, to the exiles. Then the vision that I had seen went up from me, and I told the exiles all the things that the Lord had shown me. The glory not just leaves the temple, the glory leaves the city itself of Jerusalem, the place where God's name was, where God's presence was, the seat of power. And he's left the city. He's abandoned the city. And now he's left, and he's like over on the Mount of Olives, over on the just distant. He's left his people. The city is no longer his home. And this is the exact moment when that happens. This is the moment when God left his people. Now, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden Israel ended as a nation. In fact, they persisted and kept going for some time. And that's when Nebuchadnezzar comes in and destroys the temple. But the temple could only be destroyed because God had withdrawn his power and his presence from it. This is the tragic story of Jerusalem 1.0. Jerusalem 1.0 was designed by God to be a great place of worship where the king of Israel would submit himself to God and then lead the people to do what God wanted them to do, where God's glory and presence could dwell in the midst of his people. And it was as close to heaven on earth as you're going to find, because heaven, in the form of God's presence, regularly touched our mortal earth 1.0. And so the greatest moments in Israel's history happen in Jerusalem because that's where God's glory was. But sadly, Israel decided not to be faithful to the God who had formed them and started them and developed them. And so what do they do? Israel decides to abandon God, to be unfaithful to God. And in the process of all of that, God's glory leaves. Okay. You don't want me here? You don't want my glory here? You don't really care about my presence? You don't want my blessing? I'll go somewhere else. This city that you have depended on and leaned on and thought so much about, this city is just a city again. It's just another place, just like Babylon, just like Sodom, just like the Tower of Babel, just like Cain's city, just like Nimrod's cities. It's just a city, just a place where fallen people have gathered together and their sin has multiplied, and they've produced oppression and an opposition to me and to my ways. And so, you know what? You can have your city. You can have your temple. And oh, by the way, I'm going to bring somebody to destroy both of them. And in the destruction of the city and the destruction of the temple, maybe, just maybe, your hearts will be humbled and you'll realize that it was never the king. It was never the temple building. It was never the city of Jerusalem that provided for you and protected you. It was me. It was the fact that I lived there. It was the fact that I was there. It's the fact that I determined to do good things for you and provide for you, and I protected you from all of your enemies. That's why. And my glory has gone away. My glory has departed. And Jerusalem is desolate. And when people walk by Jerusalem and they see she's been broken down with fire and destroyed, they're going to go, what happened to that place? And people who know will say, you know what happened? They abandoned the God who brought them there, and they turned to other gods. So he withdrew his glory, he withdrew his blessing, and he brought his punishment instead. Because cities always end up being punished. Because when cities are run by fallen people that are not under the authority of God, then they want to make a name for themselves. They want to build their own reputation. They want to become masters of their own fate. And they want to live independently of God. And they want to do whatever the heck comes into their minds. But the Old Testament prophets, who, by the way, were always realists. The Old Testament prophets were not dreamers, people that had all these things in their minds and like they never, no. The Old Testament prophets were the most realistic people ever. They knew exactly how things actually were. But God gave them some insight into how they were going to be again in the future. And the Old Testament prophets spoke of a time in the future when Jerusalem 1.0 would be transformed. And when Jerusalem 1.0 would become a totally different city, filled with a totally different kind of people, and that get back to the original purpose for which Jerusalem 1.0 was created. And so next week, when we come back to this, we're going to start by looking at that Old Testament prophetic vision of a new Jerusalem, or a restored, cleansed, fixed Jerusalem, and what that would mean for God and for his kingdom and going into the future. And we'll talk about Jesus, how Jesus plays into that, and how that brings us all the way back to Revelation chapter 21, where we finally see a new Jerusalem descending out of heaven from God to finally live with us again on the earth. So we'll see you next week. I hope you're ready to learn. I love teaching this stuff, and I hope it's fun to learn. God bless you. Talk to you later.